Cormac Cullinan is a practicing environmental lawyer based in Cape Town, South Africa, the director of a leading environmental law firm, and the author of the pioneering book Wild Law, a Manifesto for Earth Justice, published in 2002. The book calls for what Cullinan describes as Earth jurisprudence, which places human legal systems within the context of the laws of nature, changing our relationship with the natural world from one of exploitation to a more democratic participation in a community of all life. Cormac Cullinan is a member of the Executive Committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and played an important role in drafting the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. Cullinan is a former anti-apartheid activist, and that's given him an understanding of just how fast and how completely social change can occur when the circumstances are right. Racism was the concept that once supported slavery as well as apartheid, and Cullinan firmly believes that human beings will soon realize that the failure of our laws to recognize the right of a river to flow, to prohibit acts that destabilize Earth's climate, or to impose a duty to respect the intrinsic value and right to exist of all life is as reprehensible as allowing people to be bought and sold.
The question of the recognition of the rights of nature is part of a much bigger effort, because we humans are part of nature. We share the same evolutionary history as every other thing that has come into being and that is part of this planet. And as Thomas Berry said, despite the fact that we like convincing ourselves that we are separate from nature or superior to nature, we are so integral to nature that we are more accurately described as an aspect of this earth rather than anything different to it. We are part of it. Now, I think that if one looks at the significant crises of our time, most of which are characterized as environmental crises, climate change and so forth, they arise because of human behavior. And that human behavior is based on the false understanding, the delusion, if you like, that we are separate from nature and that our role on this planet is to subdue and dominate nature, and that the best way to increase human well-being is through exploiting all the other beings on the planet. Now, in order to change that, it is necessary to shift the consciousness, if you like, of the dominant industrial civilizations to the recognition which has existed for most of human history, that our well-being depends on us maintaining healthy relationships with the other members of the community, both human and other than human. And one of the ways of shifting that is by drawing attention to the way our societies have been structured, and law and legal systems are at the heart of that. So the issue of the rights of nature is important in shifting this consciousness and in restructuring societies themselves, because if you say that to a lawyer, it sounds absurd, because we have been trained that the only possible holders of rights are human beings and what we call juristic persons or legal persons such as corporations. That means everything else on the planet, every other being, by that I mean mountain or river or species, that which has come into being, that which exists, is defined as property or a thing. Now, once something is property in the eyes of the law, it's incapable of holding rights. So when we define people as slaves, they didn't have rights and they could be bought and sold. Now, if you think about the relationship between the slave owner as a subject with all its legal rights and the slave as an object, as property, you can see that you've hardwired in an exploitative relationship between the two. The slave owner will always exploit the slave, and the slave is powerless to resist, because without rights you cannot use the machinery of the state or of social forces to protect yourself. And that is exactly the same relationship that we have hardwired between humans and corporations on the one hand and the rest of the planet, the rest of this magnificent community of life that we're part of. So by raising the issue of the rights of nature, one challenges, first of all, the assumption that we are the only subjects, because it means that nature must be a subject. It must be it must have volition of its own. And as soon as there are two subjects, humans and nature, or different beings within nature, we're into the language of relationship and relatedness. And so that shifts the paradigm. The other important thing about rights of nature is that it addresses the structural problems with society. Because, for example, I am a white South African who grew up in apartheid South Africa. And interestingly, apartheid is the Afrikaans word for separateness. It is the same thinking that we're talking about here. In that case, the idea was that the best way for white community or portion of the white community to flourish was to deny rights to the rest of the community and to exploit them. And that's exactly the same, that's directly analogous to what we're talking about here. And the only way for South Africa to begin the road towards health was to recognize rights for all of the members of the community so that the relationships can be negotiated, and that one has a negotiated relationship and relatedness, and also the possibility of the community healing is there. And that is directly analogous to what has to happen in this situation. Until we recognize that we need to change how we relate to nature, both personally and individually, but also at the structural level, we'll have problems. Because under apartheid, even if you weren't a racist person, the structure of society made it difficult for you to have black friends, for example, white friends if you were black, because you lived in separate areas, you were in separate schools, etc., etc. So the structure of society is also important. So it's a long way of saying that rights of nature is important for two very significant reasons: to change how we understand the world and our role as humans within it, and to change the structures of society to enable the humans to heal their relationships with the natural world.
Why now?
It's a good question. The need, if you like, for rights of nature probably arose only in response to legal systems which imposed this property rights regime on nature. So if you look at indigenous cultures around the world, most of them do not have a word for rights. They achieved these objectives in other ways. The idea, the concept of deeply respecting all beings was integral to their worldview, and so you didn't need this idea of rights. Once one introduces the idea of property rights and as humans and corporations as being the only holders of rights, one creates a kind of an imbalance, which then creates, in my view, a need for a counterbalance, which is recognizing rights of nature. Right now, it's particularly critical because of the situation we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a situation in which nature, the world is under, the civilization is under threat from climate change. Many species are on the brink of extinction. We're in early stages of the sixth period of mass extinction. We are really in a bad way, and human society is driving the destruction of the earth and of other species at a terrifying rate. But it's also important, I think, at this time, because we desperately need a new way forward. And environmental laws have helped, but ultimately it's clear that they're not enough. They are not achieving enough, and we're still losing the battle. And there is a new, I'm very happy to say that there is a new consciousness arising, a new willingness to take on new ideas, to try things that are fundamentally different, which is arising all over the world. I'm not quite sure why. It may be because as the crises intensify, people realize that they have to do something fundamentally different. I can't say, but whatever the reason is, in the last 3 to 5 years, there's been a kind of an energy around these ideas which I haven't seen in 15, 20 years.
You've mentioned apartheid a couple of times here. Obviously, that's got to be the dominant fact of a young South African's life in your growing up period. And you once said that once you realized how grossly unjust that was, you had to fight against it. Did you have a similar moment of illumination with respect to the natural world?
I certainly have. I sometimes experience a feeling of déjà vu in the sense of you know, I think when I was a student, I was probably more interested in partying and having fun. But once I realized exactly what was happening, because of course information was controlled, and I got a lot more information once I got to university. I felt that I would be complicit if I didn't act, and now I berate myself, although I am acting, I berate myself for, not giving up my job and doing this kind of work full time. I have the same kind of conundrums, but certainly I can't identify a particular moment. But I was very fortunate to grow up on a large property in the hills outside a small town. And I spent a lot of my youth walking in the bush with dogs, and I've always loved nature. I was one of those kids who wanted to be a game ranger and ended up a lawyer. But that's never left me. And the connection with nature, I think, is probably the most meaningful connection in my life. If I am agitated, like this morning, I got up early and took a walk at dawn, barefoot, listening to the dawn chorus of the birds, and it centers and reorientates me and gets me back down, grounds me. And for me, that is probably something which we all have, but we get disconnected from. And so this feeling, I suppose, has grown over the years as one sees the destruction and the tragedy of this wanton destruction of this unbelievable community of life, done in such a careless, meaningless way. So I can't say that I put it down to a particular moment, although there were moments when I remember with a flash of insight realizing that polluting a river is no different from slashing your arm. It's fundamentally self-defeating, self-harming, and misguided. But
well, I'm in a way. It seems to me you have, if not quit your job, you've done a second job on top of it by writing a wonderful book called Wild Law, and I think you're the person who coined that term.
Yes.
What do you take it? How would you describe wild law? What is wild law?
Well, to take a step back, I first started working on the idea of a new philosophy of law. Thomas Berry had first said, we need a new philosophy of law, which I called earth jurisprudence as a philosophy. And then, that's a philosophy of law. How do you implement it? You need certain laws. And I first started thinking, earth jurisprudence is kind of a clunky name for ordinary people. And so I first thought of using wild law as a catchier way of communicating the ideas. But once I started working with it, I realized it was much more profound than that. Wild for me is a synonym for the extraordinary creative energy which has produced this universe. I don't know what it is, but it seems to me that if one looks at the evolutionary history of the universe, we have gone from very few basic atoms to these extraordinary trees and plants and hummingbirds and this amazing diversity. And there's something extraordinarily creative that drives us. And for me, it's a wild energy. It's also, wildness for me is that part which connects human nature with the larger nature. It's that creative streak that runs through us. It's that the wild impulses of delight. So for me, wildness is the juice that drives the universe. And what I was trying to communicate with the idea of wild law is that wild law sounds strange. It sounds paradoxical because our current conceptions of law are control, homogenize, dominate, etc. It reflects a controlling mindset. And I was saying, imagine if we had a legal system, we had laws that facilitated the flow of the fundamental juices, creative juices that run the universe. If we had a legal system specifically designed to enable us to participate and to contribute to the health and integrity of the whole. If our technologies were driven not just by the desire for profit, but the desire to contribute to the beauty, integrity, and health of the whole community, not just the human community, wouldn't that be incredible? So wild laws for me, it's not just a catchy name, it's a way of showing people that we could fundamentally reconceptualize our notion of law.
Now, most people think of law as being something that tells you not to do things,
Yeah.
That's clearly not even an adequate description of the existing system of law. But you're talking about something that is not negative, is not prohibitive, it's facilitative somehow or other. Yeah?
Yes. So the broad thesis that I believe in is that if it's true that we are part of this larger system, the Earth community, and I believe that it's scientifically untenable to say that we're not part of it, then it seems to me that we need to be governed by the system, the larger system of order. So we may be like a cell in a body. We may have the power to self-regulate ourselves internally, but we also have to comply with the system of order of the whole. So the first thing is to identify what are the laws of nature, as it were, or what are the fundamentals of nature. And if we look around us, we see nature works on incredible diversity, but it diversifies, but at the same time it maintains cohesion. The more more an ecosystem diversifies, the more interrelationships there are, and the more resilient that ecosystem becomes. So you have this paradoxical situation where diversity is matched with increased cohesion. We can observe these and, if you like, deduce or induce rules of the universe from what we observe. Now, if we are going to take that as our starting point, our legal system should be informed by a desire to see how best we can regulate ourselves to be consistent with that. And to me, that is a much more interesting phenomenon. If you speak to indigenous people, they all refer to the existence of immutable laws of nature or laws of the Great Spirit, and that a great part of the human endeavor is to identify what compliance with that law requires. Shamans are involved in that. You know, how does one fit in? How does one maintain those respectful relationships? And if we start thinking of law from that point of view, it becomes not the fear-driven control impulse which is reflected in most of our law. It becomes driven, if you like, I guess you could say, by love, by the desire for connection. When I say love, I mean the desire for connection in the broadest sense. So one begins to look for situations which would encourage diversification. So laws that would control people's sexuality or any of those kind of things, to me, seem contrary to the idea that there's natural diversification and it's not a bad thing. And so it is a different conception. It's a conception of law as a self-ordering of human societies, with the recognition that we are also members of a greater earth community. Therefore, antisocial behavior is behavior which is antisocial not just in relation to other human beings, but in relation to the wider society. So it's a little bit of an abstract explanation, but I think when one looks at a particular law, one can say, is this something which, is this something that increases the integrity and beauty and health of the whole community or not? And if you apply those kind of tests, one can begin to see how to change the law to be something which enhances our participation within the community and enables us to be good earth citizens and not just good citizens of a town.
Mm. And it's quite a magnificent vision when you start to look at that, because it starts at the cellular level, right? Everything relates both outward and also inward. It's self-organizing, but also organizing as part of a larger whole.
Exactly.
And then it moves on out to the whole natural world and the whole human culture.
Exactly.
But there's also a tragic element to your thinking about this, and that is that we are trapped in what you call the homosphere.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
It's this mental construct that we've created, which is possibly, I think is extremely damaging to us. The construct is essentially that we humans live only within a human world and are surrounded by a hostile alien world of nature, full of danger, full of potential threat, etc. And how that plays out is we attempt to control and dominate nature as much as we can, and also often within human societies. So it's I used the term when I was thinking of the term. I was thinking in medieval times there were these ideas that there was this crystal sphere over the earth, and the God had heaven was above, and there were various planets, and it was all. But we were encapsulated within this crystal sphere, which was the sphere of humanity. And I think that in our heads we have created something like that sphere, which is the idea that only human beings are subjects. We are the decision makers. We're in charge, and that all decisions are made relative to human considerations. So the only law that exists is the law that comes from humans, that comes from a parliament or a judge. The only thing that counts is the economic well-being of humans. And what this does is that it creates a barrier, it creates a separateness, it creates an apartheid, if you like, a separateness between ourselves and the rest of the community. And just as you had white South Africans who believed in apartheid feeling increasingly embattled, alienated, fearful, and becoming more violent and vicious in response because they felt the otherness of the world around them. That's what's happening in our society. It's also driving things like consumerism, because an egotistical behavior and narcissism, because the belief is that it's only us. But as soon as one lets go of that and says, instead of me feeling that I have to fight for my existence by resisting the otherness of nature, by resisting this fearful world out there, and I embrace the fact that I'm part of I've had this most extraordinary birthright to be part of the most incredible community one has been able to find in the entire universe, everything changes, and one looks at how to enhance connection rather than... So breaking the homosphere is essential. It's that terrible self-defeating mindset which keeps us separated, which feeds alienation, which feeds the need for domination, which feeds the need, quite frankly, to stuff our faces and accumulate goods.
I'm fascinated that you use the word fear in such a prominent way in that, because it seems to me that as I read what there's a sort of opening that you've achieved personally, and that so much of what we are looking at here is driven by fear, in that, like, you have outside the homosphere this terrifying world of wild beasts and things that will harm you and bite you and give you diseases, and and it's you watch television. The country is a place of great danger, right? It's always It's sort of horrible, and then we've recreated that within the homosphere by creating the kind of society in which you're perfectly right to feel quite fearful very often. There's lots of human situations in which our misconception of the natural world is transplanted into the way we actually behave towards one another.
Exactly. I think that it's arguable, or it's an interesting hypothesis to see that maybe this is part of the evolution of the human, where we have to move from our reptilian brain, which is sort of fear and impulse based, to our neocortex, and start acting more from our neocortex, where we can have these emotions of love and compassion. And certainly the great thing, though, is I think that we are hardwired to connect. Wilson talks about this idea of biophilia, the idea that we love other living creatures inherently. And certainly if you see a child in a room and there's an animal in the room, the child will make a beeline for the animal. I think we educate our children out of this. We educate them out of a natural sense of connectedness and love for other living creatures into this fearful place. And I think it's a terrible tragedy, and that for that reason, exposure of particularly children, but all people, to nature in its pure form, or any form, I think is extraordinarily important for the maintenance of healthy human psyches.
So once you've got that sort of understanding and you want to kind of turn things around, people like Thomas Berry, for you, become very prominent, right?
Yes.
And tell me about Berry's conception of the great work, because that leads to your conception of the great jurisprudence, right?
Yes. So when I first met Thomas in America, he was an old man, and the first time I met him, I was really struck with his sense of urgency. He spoke a lot about what he called ultimacy, and his idea was that we were in critical times as a planet and as a people, and that there was a moment of grace, a window period in which it would be possible to avert disaster. And he was an old man, and he was wanting to pass the baton on. He was wanting to inspire future generations to carry on the work that he'd been doing. So as a much younger man then, I wasn't a greybeard, I was very inspired by that, and particularly his idea of the great work. He said, at different times in civilization, there have been, a great idea driving the culture. It might have been an idea of empire or something like that. But right now, the task facing us is to reconceptualize our idea of the human and our role within this community of life, so that we can move from a destructive presence, as he called it, to a mutually enhancing presence, so that the role of the human is to fulfill, to play our role in the wider community of life, to fulfill ecological niches, if you like, ways in which we can feed ourselves and make livelihoods for ourselves that also contribute to the whole. So definitely meeting Thomas and understanding the urgency of the situation and his idea of the great work, and that this is the challenge of our times. And I completely believe that. I believe that if you were an alien from another planet and you came to this planet, you would in a short time conclude that the key issue was the relationship between the species that had populated all over the earth, the humans, and their habitat, and that was the key, shall we say, issue of the day. And so leading to the great jurisprudence, Thomas said, he pointed out the different areas of society in which one needed change, and he said the legal aspect is particularly important because it's how societies structure themselves and how they perpetuate themselves. Thomas Lindsay often refers to it as the DNA of society, and legal systems are quite like that. It's a good term. It's how they replicate and reproduce themselves. And Thomas called for a new jurisprudence, and I thought somebody else would deal with this, but after a while, when nobody was, I sort of went where angels fear to tread and decided to just have a go myself. And the idea of the great jurisprudence was, I coined the term really to differentiate between the situation where some of the rules of nature, if you like, how the universe works, that is already set. It predates us, it's beyond our control. So I call that the great jurisprudence, the wisdom of the universe, if you like, the self-ordering structures of the universe, which are immutable as far as we are concerned.
In a sense, the great DNA of nature, almost.
Exactly, right? The DNA of the universe. That's a lovely way of putting it. What we then needed to do is develop human jurisprudences, human philosophies or theories of law and governance, which were consistent with that. I called those earth jurisprudences. Recognizing by using the plural that they may be, it's appropriate to have different variations in different places because cultures are different, but they would all share a consistency and a congruency with the great jurisprudence. And then one would have what I was calling wild laws, broadly speaking, to implement that understanding of the role of law.
One of the fundamental concepts there is the idea that we should behave in ways that enhance the natural world and that enrich both us and the natural world of which we're a part. Can you give some examples of what that would look like?
Yes, I think Thomas Berry himself and Aldo Leopold and various other important thinkers reached times in their lives when they recognized that the touchstone for them, the fundamental touchstone of which you use to decide whether something's good or bad, whether it's right action or not, concerns the health, integrity and beauty of the whole. Thomas Berry referred to the experience when he was very young, seeing a field of lilies and having that recognition. Aldo Leopold was after seeing the green light dying in the eyes of the wolf that he'd shot. And I think that is fundamental. If one looks at the idea of an ecological niche or niche, it's a situation in which some species has found a way of looking after themselves, which also benefits the whole. So you could think of perhaps a cleaner wrasse, a little fish in coral reefs that picks the parasites off the gills of larger fish. The little fish gets its food and the larger fish benefit. And because there is a mutually beneficial relationship, it will persist, it's sustainable. The big fish will keep coming back and the little fish will be there to provide that service. And what most humans, not all humans, have lost is the conception that we could fulfill our own well-being in a way which is conducive to the whole rather than destructive of it. Now, I don't mean by this a situation of no harm, as it were. Ecosystems are held together, for example, by food chains. It is really important that things eat other things. So it's not a situation where I would say Nobody should hunt an animal perhaps to eat. But what is deeply destructive, because within limits, that doesn't disrupt the system. But when you have a situation where humans slaughter vast numbers of animals or treat them terribly cruelly, those cannot be ways of behaving which enhance the integrity, beauty, functioning, and cohesion of the whole. So a lot of what I'm speaking about is how we do things. And I think that this is where the concept of relatedness comes in, that we need to negotiate our relationships. If one looks at how we've related to other animals, for example, our standard response when we come into conflict with another animal is to kill them and, if possible, exterminate them. And it becomes much more difficult, like in my hometown, Cape Town, where there are baboons in a national park in the center of the city that are protected, and they come into the suburban areas often. It's easy if you can just kill them, which you can in most of the country. But if you can't, and you have to negotiate a relationship, it's much more difficult and much more complex. But that is exactly what we have to begin the process of engaging with, is how do we negotiate a live and let live a relationship with everything on the planet. So in terms of mutually enhancing relationships, I would say at a micro level, if one tries to adopt that approach, if you have a garden, gardens are often areas where people try to exercise maximum control over nature. But you could conceive of your garden as a place of joy, not just to you, but as a habitat for other creatures. We could start thinking of our cities as wild cities, as cities which are not just set up in opposition to the terrifying nature outside and have a wall around them conceptually, but it's homes not just for humans, but for other species, to allow that wildness to penetrate the city, to release the rivers from their concrete coffins, and let them go wild. So there are ways of relating which are mutually beneficial, and we need to move away from ways of relating to everything that is a one-way flow. Because if we have an exploitative relationship with any other person or being, it's not sustainable. Because if there's a one-way flow of benefit, sooner or later it's exploitative. It just either destroys the other person or ends the friendship, etc. So I think at the heart of moving towards this approach is to look at how we relate to everyone and everything, and saying, is this a relationship which could I reconfigure this relationship in a way that would be beneficial not just to myself, but hopefully the other participant, and if not the other participant, at least to the whole.
You'll be amused by this, but one of the things that I was struck by as I read your book was by how African you are, and how the examples were African examples. I mean, your example of the animal in the city that you have to get rid of was an aardvark, which most of people like me have never seen, digging up fence posts that have been erected by farmers to keep jackals out, and I've never seen one of those either.
But like a coyote, and smaller.
Well, but it raises an important question, which I find I've been wrestling with quite a lot through these interviews, which is, how do we become indigenous? Because, you know, like your background is Irish, right? Your family, we grew up in this little green island, far, far from where they are now. Mine was Scottish, just across the water, and now I'm thousands of kilometers away too. And we don't belong to Scotland, we don't belong to Ireland, we clearly belong to South Africa or Canada, but we have no way of doing that in a way that makes us, in a sense, co-indigenous with the people who were there in the first place, right? We can't go back, but we somehow have to go forward to a way in which we really do belong, as we probably don't now. Right?
Look, the most important thing to start feeling that you belong is to break out of the homosphere, you know, and to recognize that it's your birthright to belong. You are an earthling. Each one of us is an earthling. So we're all indigenous to the planet. Culturally, of course, it's a little bit different, as you point out. Although I was born in South Africa, and my father was born in South Africa, you know, my ancestry is Irish, as you say. But my consciousness has been shaped primarily by the environment that I grew up in. My sense of what a good day is is informed by the fact that I grew up in a sunny place. And I think that what is how one indigenizes oneself, if you put it that way, is by relatedness, by connecting with place and with the other beings in that place, and if you like, accepting that we are the communities that we belong to are the ones we live in. The birds we hear when we wake up in the morning, the animals we see, the feel of the wind on our face, that is determined by the place that we love. And how the more one loves and connects with the place, the more one is of that place, and the more one is a full and integral member of that place. But the point that you pointed, however, I think is significant. The loss for many of us is the wisdom of the cultures that had accumulated knowledge of how to be part of that place and of that place over thousands of years, and could impart it directly to their children. So many of us have had our cultural libraries burnt, and that's the job. It's not that we can't or aren't part of the ecosystem, it's that our knowledge, our human knowledge of how to do that well, has been impoverished.
And we've also done, both in Canada and in South Africa, a terrible job of relating to the people who were there first. So in a sense, we have been deliberately burning not only our own libraries, but theirs. Right?
Exactly. I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking when one looks at the wanton destruction of human cultures and languages and the conceptual understandings. Because for me, being exposed to indigenous cultures around the world has been absolutely critical in expanding my idea of what's possible. You know, when I first started working with these ideas, people would say to me, but if you're a lawyer, how can you be a lawyer for a mountain? You can't take instructions from your client or a species, etc. And it seemed to me to be quite a good point. You know, it's quite insuperable. And then you come across other cultures, like in this part of the world, in Latin America, in the Amazon, where shamans will go into a trance state and negotiate with the master of the animals about how many animals they can kill in a hunt, and then they go off and hunt. Now, whether one believes from a Western sense that that's possible, it's not possible in a Western conceptualization of the world. The fact is that those societies have developed many mechanisms for communicating very directly with nature, to negotiate their relationships with nature. There are many different versions of it. So when you come across fundamentally different societies, and particularly the societies that haven't fallen under the spell of the industrial, materialist, people are separate from nature way of thinking, it expands one's understanding of what's possible, and you begin to see that there's an extraordinary correlation between indigenous cultures around the world. And to me, that is very meaningful. They all say it's really important that one identifies and follows the pre-existing laws of nature. They all talk about that. They all talk about the fundamental importance of respect and respectful relationships. They all have rituals of thankfulness and recognizing reciprocity. If a shaman, a sangoma in southern Africa is collecting plants, he or she will leave a pinch of snuff or tobacco as a symbolic giving for the taking, and to acknowledge the debt. And yesterday I heard Tom Goldtooth describing exactly the same thing in North America. So indigenous cultures that are left in the world are extraordinary repositories of knowledge which our whole species desperately needs. And you know, people sometimes say, is there some noble savage argument view going back to some imagined past? Not at all. This is a situation in which one is extraordinarily foolish if you're trying to find a way into the future and you don't draw on the existing knowledge of people who know how to deal with the problems you're facing.
Who have worked it out over evolutionary eons, really. Right?
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
Yeah, that's the library.
It's been tested in the laboratory of reality of time.
Now, when you come to this sort of point in a conversation of this kind, I find myself looking at that and saying, if you look at the planet that we're on now, that's hurtling towards, catastrophe, and someone comes along and says there is another way of doing it, and you haven't quite eliminated it. It's here to be had. It seems unbelievable that our species wouldn't just say, "Oh, thank God," and go and look at that. Are you struck by a sense of unreality about the kind of period in which we find ourselves?
I do. I periodically feel like that story with the emperor with no clothes on, when only the child says the emperor's got no clothes on and everybody else pretends that they can see the children. Because the fact of it is that if you look at most of society, we're collaborating in this incredible collective delusion that we're in charge here, that we can run this planet, that we know we have a sufficient understanding of the complexities of how it works to manipulate it in a way that works in our favor, that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. Our system is based on a vast number of delusions, which are, even by Western scientific measures, are clearly untenable. It's completely untenable to say that we're not part of the system. It's completely untenable to say that in the long term the future of humanity is not dependent on the future of their habitats. But I think that what's happened is that we do also need to work with the internal levels. We have to recognize that in the same way as telling an alcoholic that drinking is bad for them doesn't stop them drinking. They understand that, but there are other forces at work. We have to work at those deeper levels. We have to address issues like the fear, and we have to address these things both collectively and personally. And one of the antidotes is to expose people to places where they can feel that connection, because once you've connected, the wild creative forces of the universe flow through that connection. It's like plugging into a vein. Once you've got the connection and the wild energy flows through you and the connectedness increases, you have a sense of being part of the whole. And quite frankly, the love, the biophilia also gets stronger. And that's the antidote to the separation. The separation I see is a kind of a constriction. When we separate ourselves from nature or people, it's a bit like we put a tourniquet around the vein or the artery. It starves that flow, and we are the ones that wither and die. So connection is extraordinarily important for mental health and for who we are.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't heard that analogy before. But when you say that, you think, yes, if you close off the connection of a part to the whole, what you create is gangrene, right?
Exactly. And the homosphere does that. It comes down and cuts off those connections. You know, the idea that everything out there is going to eat or kill you if it has a chance. You know, all of those fears, they sever those connections or constrict them.
Yeah. But nevertheless, you remain with what I increasingly see as quite a tragic vision of where we are in the universe. You remain a very good, a very cheerful person, and I think a very hopeful one in a deep way.
There are times when I feel despairing, when I hear columns of methane gas bubbling up from the ocean bed and things like that. But I guess my working model hypothesis is that if I go down into despair, I don't get out of bed on a Monday morning. That's not what gets on. And it would be terrible to give up and then to find out at the last minute that had we only taken some action, it would have been saved. But I think one of the things that is really important and useful in this, and Vandana Shiva has talked about this, is letting go of the ends. In other words, saying the reason why I'm participating in this work is not because I think we're going to win, but because I think it's the right thing to do. And in that regard, I'm very encouraged by, there were generations of wonderful people, wonderful activists, people with huge hearts who fought for the end of apartheid and never lived to see it. They went to their graves not knowing if it would ever end, but they acted through the deepest, best parts of humanity, through the conviction that it was right action to stand up for what was wrong and to work for a better society. And they had a faith that it may one day come about. But I think all of us need to accept that despair is the enemy of action, and that although one would have to say that if you were a betting person that the odds are against us right now, and certainly success and transformation is by no means guaranteed, neither of those are reasons to stop doing what is right and to play our part in the whole. And Thomas Berry had a faith that the universe and the earth had a bias in favor of its continuing evolution and flourishing, and that because we're part of that there will be people who will arise, as we see now, to take forward that more hopeful vision. But the truth is, I don't know. It could end very badly for all of us, but I would rather go down having tried than having given up in despair.
One of the things that that you've given to me is the example of apartheid as an apparently hopeless situation, just founded on brutality and injustice and looking totally entrenched. And it collapses in no time at all. When the time comes, it goes away, and people like Mandela, who've been considered criminals, becomes one of the most admired people in the whole history of the human race. Right? It's a wonderful story.
It's an extraordinary story, and I think I'm particularly privileged to have lived through it. And I think that's one of the things that I draw on. That I'm very lucky as a South African to have been a participant in a successful revolution. South Africa has its problems now, but it's nothing compared with where we were when I was growing up. And we live. I was at a concert in Cape Town recently celebrating Mandela's life in the period of mourning before he was buried, after his death and before he was buried. It was quite extraordinary because as a nation we were overwhelmed by the sorrow of losing this amazing man who had been so influential in all of our lives. But we also celebrated, and this occasion was mainly celebration, because to have had such an extraordinary human being at that point in our history was incredibly important. And for a man to come out of prison in his 70s and do what he did, and for that change that so many had dreamt of to actually happen, as you say, in an extraordinarily fast way, in a way which none of us could quite have imagined. I mean, I was one of the people. I'd been to visit the ANC in exile in Lusaka shortly beforehand. I didn't see it coming as quickly as that. I was in Europe when it happened, and it's taught me that it can happen. I've experienced it. It can happen, and it can be unpredictable. But it would never have happened without those years of people working at it. So you don't know when the tipping point is going to come. But it will never come unless you put in the work beforehand. But certainly as an activist now in this much bigger struggle, much more important struggle than the struggle against apartheid, I am able to draw on the experience of coming from a situation that looked completely hopeless and triumph. I mean, it was wonderful standing in that stadium, and there were little kids of all colors playing around with each other, little girls playing games like this, and no sense of color. There were people singing and celebrating the new South Africa and Nelson Mandela's contribution. And I looked around at one point, and I suddenly turned to my wife and I said, "Good Lord, we won. We won." The vision of a post-apartheid South Africa happened. It's imperfect, but it's there.
You told us yesterday, and I'd like you to tell me again a bit about the Freedom Charter, because it's when you start to think about, well, how did that happen? Things like that become tremendously important, right? That's
exactly.
So tell me about the Freedom Charter.
So I really believe that fundamental to how human beings work is we first have to believe, we have to have a vision of what's possible. Whether it's that you're sick and you believe you can get well again, or whether you can believe you can change society. So the dream, as Thomas Berry would call it, and many indigenous people would call it, is really important. If you can't conceive of a society beyond apartheid, you will never get there. So in the 1950s, when the apartheid regime was extremely repressive, the civil society organizations were relatively weak. Apartheid, the ideology was in its ascendancy. There was a lot of power behind it. There was force behind it. You had ordinary people in South Africa, Democrats, Congress, Indian Congress, the African National Congress, the Congress of Democrats, the white people, people got together and said, we need a vision, a positive vision that we can work towards of a society that isn't like this. And they went around and they gathered submissions, and there were meetings all over the country, and ended up in a conference at Kliptown which adopted the Freedom Charter, which is an aspirational document describing the society, the dream, the society that I aspire to. It had statements like the doors of learning and culture shall be open, people shall have peace and security in their homes. It was a non-racial society of justice, etc. And that vision that was articulated through a process that drew on many, many thousands of people, and in other words, it was an articulation of the voices of the people that was suppressed by the official system, became an inspirational vision which inspired and guided all kinds of actions. You know, protests for equal education, for example. You would see people holding up banners saying the doors of learning and culture shall be open, and that vision was one of the visions that took us into the new South Africa. That was a document that had no legal status. The government tried to suppress it as much as possible, but because it was authentic, because it had a legitimacy coming from the people, it was an expression of their dream. It came about and was extraordinarily influential. And that's why at this time, I think one of the things that we need to work on is, instead of only resisting the terrible things that are happening, we need to say what we're for. We need this vision of a better society, because as worthy as sustainability is, it's too boring. Nobody's going to go to the barricades. People go to the barricades for liberty and freedom and justice and for visceral things. They don't, and although I believe in ecological sustainability, what we need is something much deeper, and we need to go motivated by a vision of a better society, a connected society where we feel part of this planet, where we can be more fully human beings. And so part of what I've been working on in South Africa is this People's Charter for Africa. We produced a draft just to start the conversation, but the challenge now is how to create a process which will pull in as many people as possible into this conversation, because the mere fact of having the conversation is incredibly subversive to the existing system. As soon as people start talking about a different future, the old starts being whittled away. And it's partially a way of getting people to think in a new way and to imagine a new future. But if you can pull it together into a cohesive vision that is shared by many people, it sets in motion, I believe, a chain of actions which it's like a strange attractor or a vortex. The dream pulls the action towards it. And so I think it's important.
That's a lovely vision of the dream pulling the action into itself, in a sense. And when you talked about earlier about you were talking about the unchanneling of the rivers, for example, removing them from their coffins. I found myself thinking about my own city in a somewhat different way, because that has been done in a number of places. Toronto has now got a map of its original drainage basins, and people are slowly uncovering them and opening them up. And I thought, what a difference that would make, just that one thing.
You could start a river liberation movement.
A river liberation movement.
Liberate the river. Let the wildness flow. And obviously, one has to think about it. You don't want to get people killed in floods, but at the same time, a liberated, living river that is determining its own course to some extent, its own, and it has got wildlife associated with it, is a thing of joy and inspiration in the city, in a way that a concrete canal isn't.
No, that's right. And if you had a city that felt like this, for example. I guess I want to come back finally to the whole business of the rights of nature, legal rights of nature, because you were also part of the group that drafted the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth in 2010 in Cochabamba, and when we've only got one life to spend and only so much energy to spend it on, it becomes really important to put the lever in at the point where you can actually move something. Am I right in saying that for you, the rights of nature and the whole environmental rights movement represents that kind of point where your small amount of energy can be amplified to the greatest possible extent?
Yes. If one looks at an analogous document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that also wasn't a legally binding document. but it shifted the norms of acceptable behavior in society in a way that's been quite extraordinary. And it's now completely accepted. If a government is criticized or an organization is criticized on the basis that they're violating human rights, it really means something in the world. And that has been extremely important. And I think that this approach is one of those leverage points because it addresses many things at once. You can't get your head around these ideas unless you shift to the understanding that we're not the only subjects. And as soon as the world is full of subjects and it's not property, it's an animate universe we live in. And it's a universe in which there are other beings that we must establish relationships with, and then we're into the world of relatedness. But it's also simultaneously addressing the structures of society that impede that connection. So it works, I think, both at the internal level, at the cultural belief level, at the external level. So in Ken Wilber's terms, it addresses all four quadrants. So I think it is a good leverage point, and I think it's got an energy behind it right now, which I can't explain why or how it's gathering, but it's certainly it's picked up steam in the last few years in quite an extraordinary way.
We got into this through an extraordinary interview with David Boyd, and David's book, The Environmental Rights Revolution, which sort of inspired this, you know. And I said to David afterwards, it's a lovely book, and anyway. But I said to him afterwards, I think you have described in a way the unified field theory of environmentalism. I mean, this is that change which, if implemented, would resolve all kinds of other issues. You know, you're picking away at this specific and this specific and this specific,
exactly.
But this one addresses the whole thing.
Exactly. And I think, you know, the problems that we've got are systemic problems. If you look at, you know, climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of much deeper problems. It's just one of the many symptoms of it. And you can't really address climate change, in my view, at the symptomatic level. That's like mopping the brow of a person who's got a fever. The real issue is why they've got a fever. And there may be different causes. You've got to address the root cause. And this is one of the ways of addressing the root causes of all the problems, as you say. It gets to the heart of the problem, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important.
And you referred to that Universal Declaration, that proposed Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, as containing the DNA of a new society, to come back to another theme.
Yes, exactly, because if one were to take what's in that Universal Declaration and implement it, it would change everything. The economic system would have to change, the legal system would have to change, our conception of ourselves as being the only beings on the planet would have to change. In other words, our internal ethics, etc., would have to change. Cultural values would have to change, and would change as a consequences of it. And sometimes the values change first and the law follows, and sometimes it's the other way around. Like in South Africa, we have a great constitution, and one of the things in it is it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual preference. Now, there are probably more people in South Africa who are homophobic than there are who are not. But that clause in the Constitution is gradually changing South African society. Also, the clauses which prohibit racial discrimination. The day that Constitution came into force, there were the same number of racists in the country as the day before. But it tipped the balance. Now the system works against racism and for non-racism. Before it worked the other way. And it's a slow burning fuse, so gradually the society is tipping over. So sometimes the society follows the legal norm and sometimes it's the other way around. But they are extraordinarily powerful ways of changing society and of dynamiting the homosphere.
We need to end, and I want to end with a couple of quotes here. One of them, they're both from Cormac Cullinan. The day will come when the failure of our laws to recognize the right of a river to flow, to prohibit acts that destabilize Earth's climate, or to impose a duty to respect the intrinsic value and right to exist of all life, will be as reprehensible as allowing people to be bought and sold. Now that strikes me as a highly inspirational statement of what the future should be like. And it leads me to the observation that this is a book of great courage and integrity. I mean, you start out as a lawyer, but you wind up as being, in a way, a kind of an earth guru or a modern reincarnation of that or something. Well, it's a book of, as I say, of great courage and integrity, and I'm wondering how much flack you've had, particularly from your own profession, for heading out so far into the wilds.
Well, I mean, I think there's a point in the book where I suggest that if you're reading it in a law firm, you get a brown paper cover for it. but certainly, I mean, yeah, I guess I did go out on a limb, and there's certainly, I think, people who think I'm on the crazy end of the spectrum. But the fact is that I'm a practicing attorney. I run a law firm which has got more environmental lawyers than anybody else in South Africa. I'm very much in the mainstream in my day-to-day life. And I went into environmental law because I thought I could fix it that way. I thought I could play that environmental laws we could deal with this within the system, and I sadly concluded that we couldn't. And so I believe that I have arrived at these viewpoints in a careful, considered way, and I've really examined my heart and mind in getting to them. I mean, quite frankly, the first time I heard Thomas Berry suggest that maybe everything on the planet should have rights, I recoiled. I thought, the implications of that are immense, you know. It just seemed...
To which he would have said, of course they are.
Exactly. Animal rights is one thing, but everything having rights. And then I thought about it, and I thought, just because something's big or hard or difficult to achieve doesn't mean it's wrong. It's a different thing. And this is a big thing that we're trying to do. But my heart and my mind tell me that it's the right thing to do. And I'm supported in that view by its consistency with wisdom cultures from all over the world, which have existed for thousands of years. So in that sense, I have got some flack. And I think that some people think that, you know, nice guy, but a bit loopy. But I'll take the slack if it makes a difference. I'm happy to take it.
Well, happy is maybe a relevant word here, because you do come across as a happy man doing what he feels he should do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Which leads me to the last quotation from Cormac Cullinan, which is, "Much of what is best in us is contained in our wild hearts." And that is a fabulous statement. And thank you so much. In a way, that kind of summarizes all of what we've been talking about.
Yes. Yeah. And we must hold on to those wild hearts, because it's that wildness that connects our hearts with the whole, you know. And through that connection flows life. And life is what makes what's great.
Cormac Cullinan notes that all the environmental treaties, laws, and policies of the past generation haven't even slowed down the destruction of the planet. So what needs to change isn't just the laws, it's our understanding of the nature and purpose of law and governance. That need for a renewal in our relationship with the natural world is a constant theme in the interviews we've been doing about the rights of nature. We've heard it also in our interviews with legal philosophers like David Boyd and John Burroughs, and we've seen that a refreshed understanding of our place in the world would bring us close to the views shared by indigenous people everywhere. These are deep but beautiful waters, and we'll continue to explore them. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron.